next we're going to look at attacking services. We attack servers, but now we're going to attack services which will be running on our machines. So our objectives are discuss common attacks against services, identify services that are often attacked, provide an overview of denial of service, interpret simple buffer overflows, and introduce format string attacks. So attacks against services. There's three main attacks we're going to talk about: a denial of service, a buffer overflow, and a format string. What's a denial of service? Well, it's exactly what it says it is. It's an interruption to the availability of a system. It's the hardest attack to prevent because bandwidth and memory is a finite resource. And since it's a finite resource, we usually can flood it, which is why in most red teaming exercises, it's rare you get asked to do a denial of service because most people know, given enough time and resources, we can flood any finite resource. It removes the capability for the attacker. It's rarely carried out by any sophisticated attackers because denial of service. You lose the capability to access the service. Targets a specific service, usually like HTTP. It only impacts that service. So if I target HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, then that web server is not available to a legitimate user. That's a denial of service. What we do is we do either resource exhaustion, which is bandwidth and memory, or we do a flood. The most common flood we like to use is called a Synflood. The Synflood is failure to complete the three-way handshake. So we just send out a bunch of SYN packets, get back to SYN-ACK, but we never send out the final acknowledgement that would complete the three-way handshake. Instead, we just keep flooding SYN packets and creating what we call half-open connections. Enough half-open connections gets on a device or a resource, and it usually will get exhausted or overwhelmed. That resource exhaustion is the type of attack we do with what's called a ping of death. Now, ping of death was fixed with Windows NT Service Pack 3, so a long time ago. Sending a packet larger than 65,535 bytes when reassembled. The problem is, like most hacking attacks, this is why we follow a structured approach as a red team member in red team hacking. We do that because we know there's a chance that the vendor, when they patch something, will break something that they fixed previously. Some of you have probably seen that before. This is exactly what happened not that long ago with the ping of death. Even though it was fixed in Windows NT Service Pack 3, it came back around again in Windows Server 2003, Windows 7, etc., because they forgot how they fixed it way back when and one of their patches broke it. Again, it's understanding a packet larger than 65,535 bytes when reassembled in a ping of death when the vulnerability was there would cause a blue screen or a denial of service. Flooding, we've talked about MAC-off. MAC-off was used to flood switches, flood the content addressable memory, the CAM, and turn a switch in 70 seconds into a hub. That was MAC-off. Protocol weaknesses. We had the land attack and we had fragmentation attacks. Fragmentation attacks work because the device has to put the fragments together. And in TCP, order is not guaranteed. Reliability is guaranteed, but order is not. And order does not matter. I can send out packet number 10,000 before I send out packet 5. That's just the way TCP works. So the destination receives all these fragments and has to put the fragments back together. Well, the fragments, certain ways, we can bypass their monitors and their detection systems because the fragmentation allows this, they drag things. We got an overlap attack, an underlap, and a lot of different ways we can do fragmentation attacks. So what is flooding? Synflood is deviation from the normal three-way handshake. So we show there in the diagram, the normal three-way handshake is we send out a SYN or a synchronize, which says open a connection to me. We respond if the port's open with a synchronize, open a connection with me please, and an acknowledgement, I will open a connection with you. And then we respond with the final acknowledgement, which is the last step of the three-way handshake. And what that means is we've established a connection. And we go from a listening state on the socket, and for those of you who don't remember, a socket is the IP address bound to the port number. We go from a listening state to an established state. If you've ever been on a command line and do a netstat, you can see netstat-an, established connections are actual connections that have went through the three-way handshake. And the ones in the listening state are sitting there waiting for a connection. If you see ones that say send received, that means they are in a send received or a half open state, and it could potentially be a Synflood. Half-open connections never acknowledge the third step of the handshake. Send, SYN-ACK, and we just keep sending out SYNs. As I said, eventually enough half-open connections will crash the service. This example here on this slide is of Synflood.c. It's an old tool, but still very effective. It's written by a hacker guy named Kra, and it's a number of older denial of service tools that Kra's written. But Synflood.c, as you'll see, actually still does work as a SYN flooding tool. And it just generates a bunch of synchronized packets and never completes the three-way handshake. So it sends the synchronize into an open port, and the SYN-ACK comes back, but we never acknowledge the SYN-ACK, and therefore in the actual target or the victim, you get a SYN receive state on the socket, and it never closes and changes to an established state. There's an example of what Synflood.c looks like when it's been used. So as you see here, this is actually a netstat command, and a netstat command is showing you I've got all these ports listening, 135, 445, 2869, 5000, 5900, and on the local loopback, 1029 and 139. So when you look at those TCP ports, they're in a listening state. That means they have not received any communication like a SYN flag or anything else because nobody's talking to it. But then right below it, you start seeing the SYN receives. Now start looking at the IP addresses in the foreign address. This is where the packets are coming from. See how they're all over the place? This is because using Synflood.c, I use a random generation of the address. And by using a random generation of the address, it constantly changes the IP address it comes from. Why? Because most of you have some type of monitor or detection system that usually blocks by IP address. Try to take a look at those IP addresses. Are you going to be able to block all those IP addresses? Again, it's getting around defenses. Randomizing your source IP address so, one, you don't get caught. Two, maybe they won't actually detect you. And three, the packets don't come back to you, back to the source, which would indicate where the attack came from. We'll break here and do the demo for Sync 4.